So this winter weather has made me younger than Tom. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like you travel back in time.
Well, that's what happens. I thought I would try and give you a view of the snow so we can remember that 13th of December, or in December, that it snowed. So it's probably going to happen more and more, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's only icy here, but now it's 0. I think all the ice is melted, so it's just cold.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's still snow about, mainly because like this area here, nobody walks along this bit here and so forth. So, which is good. But the trouble is my window frame is just bang in the middle, so I can't like get it to be correct and interesting. But it's better than a pale wall that I usually give you, or a
you can do standing desk, couldn't you?
I tried, but it still kind of like gets in the way a little bit. So yeah.
Just have to stand outside.
Basically, it's sorry.
Just have to stand outside. It's like you're shaking the whole way.
Do live reporting from outside, slapped in the face by some like sign that's blowing in the wind, or however it goes. So my hot take today is I'm going to have to buy a new kettle because when my back was hurting, I was using a hot water bottle. And basically, to conserve water usage, I had poured water into hot water bottle. Then when it got cold, I'd pour that water back into the kettle to warm it up and then basically do that, right? So then obviously the water does evaporate a little, but you're reusing the same water because all you need is warm water, right? You're not going to taste it. So now I think because I've done that, I probably did that 3, 4, maybe 5 times. Now I feel like my kettle just smells like a hot water bottle. And like the coffees that I make kind of just are a little bit off.
Tastes like what? Hot water bottle.
Tastes like an inside of a hot water bottle because
I'm pretty sure you could sell that globally. I'm sure someone will want to send it to their sort of mate as a stocking filler.
A kettle that gives them the smell of a hot water bottle, which then makes all my hot drinks kind of off, unless it's just that it's a placebo thing and I think that it is, but it's I did empty the water. Yeah, I was like, just so long as I don't put it in the dishwasher, right? So yeah, I'll have to clean it out somehow to get it to taste right. Because I was thinking, you don't want to eat anything that you kind of like taste. You don't want to do anything too severe. So, for example, you don't want to put, for example, fairy liquid inside of a kettle potentially, because then it will taste like fairy liquid. So it's like, how do I neutralize the potential or my perception of a hot water bottle taste in my hot drinks?
So is this linked to your topic of today?
No, I was just like,
okay,
I was like, hey, I must do this in 10
off.
minutes. So then I was basically going to do it. Yeah, it's not an analogy. I'm not going to turn the hot water bottle, and therefore don't reuse the same, water. Go and get fresh water. That's the message, right? But no, the real topic that I want to talk about is what does it mean to belong? So let me just set the scene a little bit. So back when the kind of like the Black Lives Matter movement was at its peak off the back of George Floyd's murder, there was an influx of energy and opportunity and kind of like wanting to do something better more than any other time previous to that. So there was lots of discussion about inclusion, or much more intentional discussion about inclusion and diversity and what that meant. Now, what happens is like there's this urgency to it, high energy, lots of conversations, and then naturally over time, people lose the energy for it, or there's a numbness to the topic because it gets just distilled down to D&I, even the letters, right? A D&I is the letters for diversity and inclusion. So it kind of gets distilled down to, something that it is just kind of like a culture blurb, as it were. And I think really what I've been thinking about more is we were chatting in our small group last week, and we're talking about how do we be more like family. And I said, really, I didn't use the word belong, but I was kind of saying, like, rather than as saying, oh, our group should be diverse and it should be, and we should be inclusive. It's actually the way that I phrased it is I want people to bring the sing in the shower version of yourself to the group. And what I mean by that is a lot of the time you will have some sort of context switching or code switching, or you'll act a different person around a certain group of people. So for example, if you're at work, you might slightly poshen up your accent, for example, right? Or you might not say things in the conventional way that you would say it with your mates. You would change your language. You might change your appearance. You might do a lot of things to give a particular impression. And that just requires energy, and you might feel comfortable not requiring to do that. And it's a two-way thing. One, create the environment so people don't have to put on an appearance. And two, kind of that person has to be comfortable enough and confident enough to decrease that appearance or that like particular persona to be more normalized, and ultimately then provides that sense of comfort that we're not overstretching. We're not having to act a particular way. So, for example, it reminds me of like, I think accidentally have poshened up when I speak on the phone or something, right? Or when I speak to older people, I would like poshen up. I remember as a kid, we were in 36, right? Which is the building opposite our church in like youth group, right? And some guy asked me like, oh, how much is this? And I didn't think of saying, I thought 50p was like a cheap way of saying 50p, right? So I was like, oh, it's £0.50, sir. Or like, I said it in such a weird way. And it really annoyed me because like, obviously this wasn't last year. This is like years ago, right? This is me as a kid, but it annoys me that I somehow felt pressure to change how I was speaking to come across as more learned or more intelligent or something in like just a silly way. Now, I know that's a silly example, but think of that like 10x with everything, with every interaction you wanting to give off a particular persona. So yeah, really to me, I want to shift the conversation, not necessarily, I think diversity of thought, like all that stuff, opinions, mixture of opinions of different backgrounds is super important. And actually businesses that have that are more profitable. And then the second thing of like the inclusion, I think inclusion can go across board. So not only male, female gender inclusion, but also the accessibility of disabilities and alternative ways of thinking, right? We've already spoken about dyslexia and kind of how that can be a challenge, but if you empower them with the right tools, then it's not a challenge. And actually that is a great kind of like angle, as it were. So really, those are important, but really what we should be talking about is belonging. And then last thing I'll talk about.
Oh, wait, let me chime in first.
let me finish this final thing, and then we can talk about it all, right? So keep writing your notes. The final thing is like, belonging, I think, is important because in lockdown, what we found is community centers, and I'll specifically talk about churches, right? Churches closed. And a lot of people felt disconnected. Yeah, we had Zoom calls and all that stuff, but it just wasn't the same. And more than anything, people missed, they would probably say connection. It wasn't the preachers, it wasn't the worship potentially, it was the connection, right? So again, how do you kind of, like the word connection is like, oh, as in be around people. Well, actually, let's go further. Like, how do you belong to something and feel that sense of belonging in any group, relationship, partnership, family, whatever that dynamic is. So yeah, that's what I want to talk about, belonging and the importance of that, and what does that look like, and how do we make it happen? And scene.
I was listening to a podcast last week, and it's basically two guys talking about, I don't know, just a bit about guy culture and how they do a retreat for guys and how they all sort of grew together. Oh, I got to get a package. This is intense.
Well, thankfully you've got AirPods.
You got a monologue now.
All right. I was thinking today I was going to get a package as well, but obviously not. Maybe it'll come later on. Yeah. So ultimately, belonging. What does that look like? There are identities associated with that. So Tom was talking about a men's group, because ultimately I think each gender has a kind of like different pressures and different narratives. I was just saying about each genders have different narratives and pressures. So having the right spaces for those, and it ties into what you're about to say about groups. So for example, men groups, to have weekends away doing stuff.
They were basically trying just to create a safe space for people to I guess, connect, open up, and that type of thing. Because they were saying, like, as a guy, subconsciously or consciously, you're basically eyeing up who's the most powerful person, and then you put yourself in certain rankings of the loud one or the quiet one or the one, like, it's sort of like eyeing up your potential enemies. If anything kicked off, you know, who's your first freebie is a punch, and then the second one is the shield vibe. And it was quite interesting as they sort of talk about it, because then you sort of do process, like, do I think about pecking orders and that type of thing? And I think it's always, I think for me, it's more subconscious than consciously do it. But I know that some people consciously do it if they need to get to know the leader or the main social person or whatever to have an impact, or the captain if it's a sports team or whatever. But I think you do sort of eye people up of sort of pecking order wise, and knowing your spot, which was really interesting, because they're just saying, like, most of our conversation starters are a bit of killers, because it'd be like, oh, what do you do for work? Oh, I'm a CEO. And you're like, no, I'm not a CEO. So, like, you've already dropped down a peg, rather than going, like, what do you do in your spare time? Well, if they read a book, it doesn't put them higher or lower. But I think sometimes when it's like, oh, I'm a CEO and run hundreds of businesses. Oh, I'm a CEO, but I only run one business. So there's always this constant eyeing up, competitive nature that can be sort of ingrained via sports or business quite easily. I think I get it from more of a sports perspective than a business perspective, but I know it can translate over. So it is very interesting. But then going back to the belonging side, I think post-COVID, people are struggling to connect because I think pre-COVID, people were quite good at walking over themselves, I would say, and would go with the crowd because the connection's more important. But I think during COVID, it's like, well, you have to look after yourself. So then you become self-sufficient, which is good in some sense. I think it's good to be a bit both. But it's like you become so sufficient, then you don't want to budge for the connection, because you're like, my voice or my, let's say I prefer to watch a certain football team and someone else wants to watch their football team. It's like, well, I might as well just watch mine and let them watch theirs, rather than going for the point of connection. So it's sort of revisiting of going, okay, how do you have connection but also have a voice at the same time? Because how do you get like a more authentic connection than you've ever had before? Because of COVID, it has sort of burnt a lot of bridges in the sense that you just looked after yourself or your local tribe, family, friends or whatever, and it's hard to rebuild connections that are further afield naturally with local lockdowns and stuff like that happened.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about the first introduction is usually some sort of achievement-based question, right? And I think challenging us to move away from that, but it's the easy baseline, because then you can have some sort of hook to have a conversation. And I find that, okay, cool, you're a CEO. Oh, what is the business? Like you've got the second question then in your brain to allow them to share. And I think it's about balancing stuff that you need hooks on to ask further questions, because just asking questions is a good way to get that balance of depth with the balance of like now. As in, I remember reading somewhere like the best thing to approach discussions around grief, for example, is not necessarily asking how you're doing, but asking how you're doing today and grounding it in like a moment. Because we all know that, of course, like, okay, you've done this job, and that's like a catch-all question that leads on to other questions. But it could be like, oh, what interesting thing have you done today? But I understand that that's all subjective, because they might be like, I've done nothing interesting today, you know, or tell me a story about your day, or tell me a story about your week. And I think that would be sometimes a little bit harder for the person to answer in the first instance, but more interesting, and gets out of the whole, we're conversing based on, achievement to get going, and background to get going, because we need some sort of stake in the ground to orientate ourselves with the next questions and so forth. Or you bring in a hot take, right? Like, oh, did you see the queues at the supermarket? They're crazy, but that's one way to learn patience, right? You join the last queue. Like, what's your technique? Do you go to the self-checkout, or do you join the big queue? Like, whatever it is, right? You can bring the thing, because everybody has opinions. It's just whether or not they've been allowed to voice them, or that they've been asked them. So is it that you ask somebody's opinion about something? Well, hey, we were talking about this last week. My wife and I were discussing this subject where, like, we're figuring out, is it A or is it B? Like, how would you have approached it? And that kind of stuff. And I think broadly speaking, it's the way that you belong is we get better at conversations, and not necessarily just talking. We're also listening, and more kind of moments in the moment, I guess. Similar with introverts, extroverts. I naturally spot introverts and kind of go alongside them a little bit and like, hey, how are you doing today? Like, how's your day been, or whatever, and have those like side conversations that it doesn't need to be a big thing. And I find that introverts, generally speaking, are great at asking questions. Extroverts more so talk about themselves. So it's good to like have all this awareness of how these dynamics work, and kind of play around those to kind of find the best balance, as it were, And like, second thing is about, if you are in a group or a large group and you've noticed somebody's not spoken, you could be like, hey Tom, like, what do you think to what we're saying? You got anything to add or anything like that? And that's basically an extrovert needs to realize when they're talking too much, and bring other people in that haven't been speaking. It's not as if they've not got anything to say, even if it is just no, I agree with everything that's been shared, I have nothing to add. That is still an opinion, a valid opinion. Yeah. Agreeing is as good as disagreeing.
Yeah, it is an interesting topic, belonging. Do you find that you are is there different stages of belonging, or different groups of belonging, or do you just feel, right, I belong in life? How do you sort of perceive it? Because you've been daydreaming about it a little bit more than I have.
I think the easiest starting point is the difference of how you are with your friends versus how you are in whatever your work context is, whatever your like mission context is, whether or not you're volunteer, whether or not you're part-time, whether or not you're full-time, whether or not it's whether or not you're retired and you've got a community group or whatever, are those two people similar? And if they are, cool. If they're not, why not? And it's just kind of trying to be a more consistent version of yourself, just for your own energy levels. So I think, obviously, when you join a group to begin with, you feel like the outsider. And naturally, the best thing to make you an insider is that people ask you questions or are interested in you. But then sometimes after that earlier stage, people ask you less questions because the typical questions are now old. So it's more so connection at the start is, broadly speaking, easy because it's it's a blank slate. You can ask all sorts of questions to get you going. But then it's kind of like the ongoing connection, I think, is harder because it takes energy to be interested in people, and it takes intentionality and intention to continually make sure people feel comfortable in the ebb and flow of emotions, And I think it's about basically talking about what can go wrong, like verbalizing what can go wrong. So, for example, in this call, it is like for you to basically belong in this call. It's about your opinion is valid. Like, I want to know what your opinion is by asking you. And I'm also like, it's completely fine if the doorbell goes and you have to disappear. Like, that's fine. It doesn't mean I'm not going to like dislike what you did. I'm not going to turn this call off and be like, oh, why did you do that? It's about like removing all that stuff and maybe narrating the boundaries of what's allowed, what's not, and what's not allowed. And more so kind of like basically the permissions aspect, right? Like even if randomly, if you wanted to change subject or if you spoke over me because you wanted to get your point across, that is fine with me. Like, I'd rather do that because I'm okay with the context switching. So I guess it's more a case of, we all know these sub-narratives, all these things going on. And sometimes there are some additional sub-narratives that we don't know. So voice the ones that we do know about and also voice kind of anything that you don't know about, right? Based on your own experience. For example, don't worry about saying, like, if you don't know how to read a word or whatever, just like give it your best go. We're all like struggling at reading every now and again. Like it's fine. Or if you don't want to read, that's completely fine. We'll get someone else to read. Just like try and throw in as much caveating to make things feel like you're okay. It's not a performance. To be in this group, you don't have to perform. And that's really, really challenging, because I think everybody feels the need to perform or give their best version of themselves. And that comes at a cost, an energy cost. And it's whether or not you can do that consistently. And to be honest, the best version of yourself is the vulnerable version of yourself. Right. So I know that I've kind of like said there's a different stages, but yeah, it's easy to kind of like feel the sense of belonging because there's this high intensity of people asking you questions whenever you join a new group, and they're figuring you out and like asking you stuff. But then it's the ongoing thing. And really, I think the best sense of belonging is about shared experiences. So are you in a group where you're creating positive shared experiences? Because a lot of the time that then becomes the new baseline of conversations, because you can recount stuff in the same way that we have a shared experience of this podcast, and we can recount, different funny things. Like, for example, that I can't remember celebrity names, and I just end up calling them, different objects to kind of like remind myself, or whatever, right? It's like a funny thing to joke about. And it's not a joke at my expense. It's a joke about the situation, right? Because we all get to those, we all have those moments. So yeah, never like humiliating anybody and laughing at the situation rather than a person.
Yeah, it is interesting because we were at like a church group, a small group, and we were talking about what happens if, let's say you hear, I don't know how we got onto the topic, but it's basically if you hear bad news from, let's say, someone let's say a colleague, what do you do? And most of the girls were like, well, we would also share our bad experience and it would be a bonding session. But then most of the guys were like, well, we wouldn't want to share our experiences if we're putting more bad experience on top of their bad experience. So actually we'll just basically draw it out of them. So it's really interesting seeing the sort of the duality that there's no necessarily right or wrong answer, but one person feels like you're putting it onto someone, and then one person feels like you're sort of attaching through the pain or the hardship. And it was a quite interesting chat because I've never viewed it like that before, I think, because I never I don't know, I've always wanted people to have fun and have joy and that type of thing. So I would naturally not go, oh, and I'm struggling as well. I normally crack a joke or ask them how they're doing. I would lean towards either a joker or a counsellor, and not someone that's sort of a peer-to-peer element that I'm sort of learning as I get older. It's like actually people respond to that sometimes even more, because actually saying a joke, as much as your heart is you want to make them have joy, it might not be the right stage or the right location, or you might misread something and they might take it wrong because they're in a more sensitive spot. So actually, even though your heart and your application is pure, it can feel like you're jabbing or stabbing or whatever someone's heart. And I think it is quite interesting. I think that sort of discussion quite, I don't know, made me view it in a sort of a different light. So now I sometimes take a step back of if someone's hurting, I sort of go, do they need a lightness to this pain? Because sometimes you do need to step out of the pain, have a laugh, go back into it, step out of it, because it's just coping mechanisms. Or is it actually, no, you need to sort of sit in it? But it's such a fine line, because equally, if you do share about your pain, you don't want it to turn around of, I'm ignoring you, now I'm talking about myself. So it is like a really interesting sort of different world when it comes to emotion. I think I feel like I'm new to it a lot of the time, of understanding the sort of unspoken rules about emotion that I'm learning through my marriage and courses and other things that I've just never. It's as if you're sort of seeing into the matrix. I find when you learn about emotion, you see things on a completely different sort of 3D, if not 4D view of life. I guess it's like having a new sense. If it's like smell or sight, it changes everything.
Yeah, it's challenging because everybody is uniquely different, and we get better over time, and that's fine, right? In the sense of when it comes to one area of shared experience or like an emotional experience is kind of like losing somebody, right? And I found like over time I've got better at it. One, I used to be like, oh, well, that person doesn't want to necessarily talk about it, right? Because you want to think about the happy thing. But actually then it makes that person that they've lost literally disappear into thin air as if that person never existed. And as I've got older, it's actually about valuing those memories and stuff and kind of recounting that, not as a be scared to recount, but be kind of like happy to recount it, because then that person, you kind of like respecting that person existed in your life. And one thing that I've like been doing, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily right, I'm just sharing from experience, but if someone says, you know, let's say that someone shares that their grandparent has passed away or something, I'd be like, oh, that freaking sucks. Like, grandparents are super special, aren't they? You know, like, and not, I'm like saying it because I had grandparents, so I know it, but I'm not making it about me. So it's still their thing, you know, like, man, uncles are super great, or like aunties or like whatever, or siblings, you know, it's kind of recounting like the special aspect of that relationship, and kind of giving it back to them. So they're like, yeah, it is. And I think it's, not being embarrassed to remember a memory, which is quite funny, you know, to remember that person by, and for that not to be anything offensive. Yeah.
And I think it's going back to your thing. Like, I've done a course recently on the sort of emotional health and learning how to understand your emotions and how does your body or mind react to different emotions, sad, happy, and that type of thing. And then how to, I guess, walk through it, or rather than stuff it down. And that basically quick summary. And they basically say you can narrate what you're going through. So let's say there is a sad person. Normally they say it for yourself, but in this case you could go, I really want to support you and connect you, but I don't know how to. And they say it's really, sometimes you can just share your heart and you don't know the application, and you can give them the opportunity to be like, well, actually a good way to show me love is just give me a hug right now. So you're like, cool, I'll do that. And it is sort of that narrating your heart of going, I feel confused because I'm all like happy for the good memories, but also sad for this information, and I don't know how to process it. What do you want me to do? And it's one of those things that sometimes they might not necessarily have an answer, but that's okay because you've sort of come open-handed with your answer, and you're like, I have no idea what to do. What do you want me to do? And the other person might be like, I don't know. And you're like, cool. Like, I'll just sit here for now, and we'll wait until something pops up. And if nothing pops up, that's okay as well.
Yeah, well, one of the best ways, again, like when you come into a group or a one-on-one, and if someone shares something like that's going on, and you're just listening, and you might be asking questions to kind of like understand like how they're viewing it. And I think one of the best questions is like, how can we help you? Like, in what way can we best support you? And I think that just, you don't need to know the answer, just being comfortable enough to be like, that sounds super difficult. Like, how can we best support you right now? And I know it sounds cringy, but actually that's the best thing, because you give the person an opportunity to be like, I don't need anything right now, just need you to listen. Then you're like, cool, one less thing to kind of like put on a to-do list, right? So you've like served them, because I think there's always this sense of, because we were talking about, you know, when you introduce someone, or sorry, when you're kind of like new to a group, you're asked about your achievements. It's also about, you know, what you do is valued. So if you're not doing anything from a visible, tangible sense, then it feels like you're not pulling your weight. But actually listening is as important as, you know, it is a doing thing as important as any other doing thing.
And I think with that type of context, it's like, I sort of find emotion can so happily fall into the grey area, in the sense that you might not know how they're feeling, you might have not communicated your thoughts, so there can be a lot of miscommunication. But I sort of feel like when things are black and white, like when you've shared specifically what your heart is and you don't know what to do, and the other person says they don't know what to do, then there's like a clarity of, you know, where you both stand, rather than like oh, that person was really offish with me because maybe they were feeling confused and didn't really know what to do physically with their body. And the person's like, I felt rejected in that moment. And I think it is just, I think the course sort of helped me go, by building boundaries and clarity, sometimes it just helps you out, even though you both disagree or you both are confused or whatever, but at least you know that, rather than you're confused and then the other person's rejected because actually they're just picked up on your confusion and you don't know what to do. So it's like, oh, that's really interesting. Because they were saying actually a lot of us do carry a certain energy when we go into a room. Obviously there's performance energy that you may or may not know, but also there might be just a physical joy or equally a depression that people will not, or some people might not pick up on it, but a lot of people will pick up of like, oh, that was a bit strange. Like that person wasn't as warm and welcoming as they normally are. And it's one of those things, it's like, it is so interesting sort of trying to connect with people. And then equally, I guess it's sort of, when you're building a new bond, what if you go through a hardship, trying to open up and share and make sure that trying to think that they're trying their best to connect and help you, even though it might be like but you should be grateful that you've got one grandparent instead of two. And you're like, well, I didn't really need that now. But you're like, you can get clarity of going, what is your heart in trying to share that? It's like, oh, because I want you to be happy because I feel sad when you're sad. And you're like, cool, actually that made me more sad by you sharing that because it didn't sort of land with where my heart is at right now or whatever. So yeah, and I think fascinating.
It's trying to share some of the uncertainty, because I think, again, we're talking about new situations. You can kind of do that quite well. But if it's a relationship that has an expectation, for example, if you shared something sad, you would expect, because of our relationship dynamic, that I would know how to behave, right? I would know what you needed without you conveying it and without me kind of asking, hey, what you need? And if I, with good intentions, share what I thought you needed, and you were like, yeah, that missed the mark, then that can be really challenging. So I think it's like, even with existing relationships, I think you have to always be kind of just careful and almost sometimes not think that sometimes, like, what do you need right now?
Because I think
and that's not a ticking box exercise. It's with obviously the empathy to it.
I was also reminded of, I know this is a slight different topic, but I'll drag it back into this topic. How you were saying you knew someone that if they were in a meeting, they would wear a cap, so then their kids wouldn't go close to them because they know they're in a meeting, and then they'll put it off. And I think half of me is like, I wonder if we can not only use clothes to promote ourselves or make us feel good or whatever, but actually, could you create certain codes with your spouses or best friends, whatever, that if you're wearing a cap, it's like, just sit with me. Like, I don't want to talk about my stuff, but I'm happy to talk about football or whatever, just to help that you don't always necessarily need to explain yourself, because then it might be A equals this, cap equals this. If I wear blue, it means I'm blue. If I'm yellow, I'm joy or whatever. It's like, imagine if you did have like your color palette and maybe you had a website of all your color palettes. To some extent, I wonder how interesting that would be of understanding someone straight away and then knowing how to react to that. Like, if it's light colors, they're more happy. If it's dark, they're less happy. But if, let's say, they walk into a room and it's dark, you're like, you can still be glad that they've still come, because that dark, you're glad that they're in the room. Even though they're wearing dark, they still feel welcome to come in that room. That a lot of the time, if you feel depressed or anxious or whatever, you might not necessarily even want to go into a room. But yeah, so it sort of made me think about, I wonder if you can do that. Because I think one thing I've noticed is if I want to focus or if I don't want to think, I put my hood up, and I think it's my sort of way of like blanking out everything around me. So it's either for tunnel vision to look at my laptop to get work done, or sometimes it's just shut off the extra sort of vision and eyesight of other things that I'm clocking, let's say, around the house that needs fixing. It's like, actually, I need to shut off my brain. And that's sort of my sort of go-to thing without me realizing that I've clocked recently.
I think any sort of tools to either communicate verbally, or to ask the right questions, or to receive the right kind of support verbally is all good. Similar to the whole emotion circle, the circle where you've got on the outside of the circle is cut up into like different emotions, and then they simplify those emotions as they go inward. So basically you might be like, oh, I'm feeling frustrated. Well, the baseline to that one, the more inner you go to the circle, is actually that is either sad or you're angry, right? So yeah, cool, you're frustrated, but are you sad or are you angry? Yeah, so Tom's showing you have to visually describe it. It's basically a circle with two layers, an outward circle and an inward circle. And basically the outward one are all the variations. So read, can you, I can't really read something. So like passionate, right? Passionate is on the outside one. So yeah, really passionate is basically the baseline emotion is excited. So you can have a better conversation because you know that there's more definitive words to kind of exactly what you're feeling. Because again, frustrated is frustrated in there somewhere. Is it in the sad section or is it in the angry section? It might not even be there.
Word search.
So, yeah. But nonetheless, I think these tools are really good.
But I think they have different ones for different. Yeah, not in this one that I can see.
Well, yeah, there'll be all sorts of different words in the outer circle, right? And I think what's fascinating is these kind of tools. You think that you would use them with kids. So, for example, yeah, the concentration cap. I'm wearing a cap. Don't interrupt me because I'm on a video call, and setting boundaries with a kid. But even kind of emotions and stuff, I think as you get older, you realize actually this kind of stuff was never taught in school. So it's okay to be learning this stuff from a baseline. And similar with like drawing or whatever, like art therapy. Not that I've ever done it, but I'm super fascinated with it because I've read about it and the benefits of doing that with kids, because it's not a verbal thing. Children might not be able to necessarily convey their emotions verbally to you, but they could probably draw a picture, and out of that picture, you'd probably be able to decipher and kind of like talk it through. And I think it's very therapeutic to some extent. So I like drawing, and I think I should draw more. And it's not necessarily that you're always drawing for a sake of an emotional output. Similar to like journaling, right? Journaling is a form of processing externally with written words. I think, art is a process of processing emotions in a visual way to some extent.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Because I knew someone that was doing that art therapy. I'm trying to recall back of what he was taught to do, and I think it was like, if you're feeling angry, like scribble, but if you're feeling, I don't know, hopeful, then draw a boat or whatever. I think he was given a bit of structure because he struggled with like, I wouldn't know what to do. So there's like a bit of like, or build a brick wall if you feel safe and that type of thing. So it is really interesting. I think for someone that is not particularly great with words at all times, I think art therapy or just generally drawing, I love sort of doodling, and a lot of the time I'll doodle and then just rub it out because it doesn't really mean anything, but I feel good afterwards.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in kind of like wrapping up, in conclusion, to some extent, what would you say
wrapping up and it's cold outside?
It definitely is cold outside. I'm too close to this window because I can feel the cold from it. In wrapping up, what would be, and you can take a little bit of time to think about this, what's one thing that can move the needle to feel more feel more of that sense of belonging in a group or in a setting? What one thing do you feel that it moves the needle? So that could be, in your experience, what you've done, or in your experience, what you've received, to move the needle, to make you feel that you belong.
For some reason, when you said, when you said, "Oh, you can think about it, and we can leave a little bit of space," half of me was thinking, imagine if we had 30 minutes of silence that someone's listening to it, or just like waiting. It's like, is this podcast over? Not yet.
Yeah, if you listen to 2 times as people, wave the arms so you can pause the video and we're talking again. Otherwise, the podcast will just have to keep going.
Moving the needle.
At least you can skip.
I don't know. I think.
Shall I give you a? Shall I
think
talk?
For me, it's like not overstretching. Because I think I wouldn't even know if this is necessarily belonging, but I think when you overstretch, so when you overemphasize helping others out, sometimes actually it's because your heart wants help. You overhelp someone else when really you need the help, and that's your way of calling for help. So I think it's sort of it's sort of holding a mirror up to your heart of going, what does that person actually need help? Or you helping them because actually you want help, and that's your body's way of communicating it because you don't know how to ask for help and how to have needs in a friendship or relationship or whatever, that we'll all have needs for love or connection or joy or whatever. But it's like, yeah, I think it's that hold a mirror up to your heart and try not to overstretch, because actually it might be your body speaking to you.
Yeah, great point. For me, I think it's about asking questions, and it's asking questions for an opinion. So, for example, rather than just saying like, "Oh, so where do you work and what do you do?" Of course, we do still need to do those things to kind of like build a baseline. But, in the week or something, I think, what's one thing about fatherhood that nobody told you about, or something? If as a person with a kid, like, what's one thing that you never read in a book, or, what have you been reading this week, or what have you been watching this week that's interesting, or something? Open-ended questions that can be tied into maybe their family situation or their dynamics or something like that. That's insightful, that there's no wrong answer to. That gives them an opportunity to just say something that has a little bit more thought to it and a little bit more of their own hot take, as it were. So I would say asking open-ended opinion-based questions that allows them to just shine a little bit more than a typical, they always know where they've been working. They've been telling that to hundreds of people, but, cool, you're newly married. So what's one new insight that you've learned since being married? I, of course, you can't ask this every day, but hopefully it's a tool, right? A tool to ask that question in another setting, Like, again, the whole, if everything paid the same, what would you do? Like, I love that question. Again, it's just asking these different questions that gets a bit of opinion, gets something new out of people. So yeah, don't overstretch yourself and keep asking those interesting questions. Until next time,
Skadoosh.
Keep hammering those nails. Skadoosh.